and welcome to the Regrettable Century. It is the dudes, all four of them, and we are gathered here today to discuss the philosophical and political thought of Tomáš Masaryk, who you should be familiar with if you've ever listened to our Czechoslovak socialism episodes. We did one specifically about Masaryk's socialism. And this time we're going to delve into it a little bit deeper because we think it has some value. Parts of it have value, I would say. Jason, why don't you go ahead and just tell us what you were thinking to accomplish with this episode?
Okay, so the first thing is just because when we did Daddy Masaryk, I got these books, The Spirit of Tomáš Masaryk, which is an anthology of his essays, and then Talks with T.G. Masaryk by Karel Čapek, or actually don't know how to say it. It's Čapek because it's got a Haček.
Yeah.
And in the course of reading over these, just because I wanted to know about this figure for this one episode we did, I think I decided that I think that Tomáš Masaryk is one of the figures that I think we should all know more about anyways, because especially in the last 2 years, really for the last 7 years, and really if we think about it even further, it's really most of our lives, but especially the last couple of years, the project of our podcast, with trying to sift through the cold stream and then revive the warm stream to salvage what is useful in Marxism, that it's often made us seem as though, and sometimes even feel as though, we have to go outside the tradition in order to find what it is that's good in the tradition and like revive it, or resuscitate it, bring it back in. And Masaryk is very much one of these figures, one of these people who represents a whole lot of what I think we have all individually and as a podcast we've talked about and found useful. And just a little teaser for one example is officially he's more of a neo-Kantian in his philosophical grounding. But it really is, I think, and Ben, I think you texted this earlier, like, I think he's way more Hegelian than he thinks he is. And Kevin, you're on mute.
Shit, sorry, I forgot I was on mute. I don't think that's true, actually. You said something I was listening to, and y'all, every time I'm not on an episode, y'all always comment that I'm never gonna hear you making fun of me. But I do hear that, by the way. I just want to let y'all know that.
That's just bait to get you to come on.
Anyway, Jason, there was an episode recently where you said something about it's Kantian, whatever, and I wanted to interject there, and I'm gonna so I couldn't interject it there because I wasn't on the episode, so I'm going to interject it here. Hegel was that's not where I want to start with that. Kant gets a bad rap in Marxist and Hegelian circles. Kant was way more interesting and complex than he's given credit for. And whenever people are called neo-Kantians as an insult in Marxist and Hegelian circles, it's not necessarily wrong, but it's a lot more defensible than it's sort of poo-pooed as being in these circles. Kant his due. The man was a fucking brilliant individual who contributed a great deal to our intellectual landscape, and Hegel is standing on Kant's shoulders when he develops his approach. So, like, it's not such a bad thing to be a neo-Kantian.
Well, there was a lot of debate in the early 20th century around these things. A lot of Marxists were really drawn to Kantianism, and what you're talking about, Kevin, this neo-Kantian, it's like a Leninist epithet that came out of those debates. So no one really knows what it means. It's
dismissing the sort of like romantic and ethical impulses of Kant's because, it's not hard-nosed and scientific enough for Leninists.
Yeah, what's funny about that is that
I wouldn't think of Kant as romantic in any sense.
Nor would I, but I would think of neo-Kantians as romantic.
I would at least think of the epithet of neo-Kantian as romantic. But I would also say that to call Hegel not romantic is kind of to misunderstand Hegel as well.
Right.
So I take your point, and I take it very seriously that it might be the case that when someone says neo-Kantian, they're not understanding Kant, and B, they're not understanding Hegel. So they're disagreeing with Kant from a Hegelian perspective that is also a disagreement with Hegel.
Right.
This is a total aside, but we were discussing recently, Jason. I can't remember who I was told, but I think that I don't know, preternaturally, I side with Kant's statement that not all things can be known. And Hegel says that all things can be known. And I think that I just side with Kant.
Yep.
I mean, that's like the major
or personally.
distinction.
Yeah.
That's like I would say if there was a single distinction between the two, is Kant, his presupposition around which all of his metaphysics is based, is that there is a thing in itself that cannot be known.
Yeah.
And Hegel, more than anything else, is that he says the mind of God is in fact comprehensible. So the thing in itself that can't be known, and the mind of God is the same thing, except for that for Hegel it can be known, and in fact it must be known.
And I think
I like to think that things can be known, even if I can't do it myself.
But the reason why I feel that way is because I think part of the conundrum of religious predilections and the reason why religion is such an important thing in history has to do with room for the unknown and the necessity of addressing the unknown. And this comes back to our contention that religion or organized spiritual, philosophies will never simply fade away with some utopian socialist realization, because there is something unknown to existence.
I mean, that's actually the somewhat tongue-in-cheek way that is often, Hegel refers to it as the absolute knowing that comes from the knowledge of the absolute in this completely comprehensive way of knowing the mind of God. He says, of course it's possible, but absolute knowing is a permanent agenda, which means that it is entirely comprehensible and it's entirely possible to know everything, but we're always going to be trying to know everything. So it's possible, but we'll never get there. So
is it not possible in a theoretic way? Sorry.
Yeah, it's possible in a theoretical sense. Like
if you lived forever, you could know everything, but since you can't,
Well, and some people would say the revelations of the in impossibly complex nature of reality in terms of like quantum entanglement in different dimensions, and how maybe if we shouldn't think of time as only linear and so on, that all of this. These are all major new revelations in the knowledge of God. And that is the thing that it was an actual impossibility in Hegel's time. And yet, in the centuries since then, we have come much closer to understanding a fuller picture of what is reality through the collective and combined knowledge of humanity, or to say the working of spirit as it unfolds in greater and greater succession. So actually, historical time since Hegel has done a lot to prove him right, or at least to show that he is at least maybe onto something.
Right. Okay, so Tomáš Masaryk.
so back to Masaryk, I think it's correct to call him, and I don't know him, but I'm not a scholar or anything like that. But based on the reading the bit of reading that I did for this episode, it seems absolutely correct to me to regard him as a neo-Kantian, and that would be his that's where he differed with Marxism and whatever else. But yeah, I don't maybe he was wrong or whatever, or right, I don't know, on this or that specific political question, but I think he had a legitimate point and to make, and valid criticisms to be rendered, and clung to values that I think any person who dreams of a better world should cling on to. So, I don't
Absolutely.
think it was all wrong or all bad. Yeah.
No, I definitely agree.
I think that like a lot of the time, and specifically whenever I was a third campus Trotskyist, I didn't want to hear criticisms of Marxism unless they were criticisms of certain type of Marxism which didn't like my type of Marxism, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But I think that like listening to criticisms of Lenin by people outside of the movement that still considered themselves socialists, or Marx or Kautsky or whomever, are absolutely something that we should do. And I think that like a lot of my criticisms of other Marxists and certain strands of Marxism, or even, Marxism writ large, are worth taking into consideration and are probably correct in a lot of instances. Like I remember reading what Oswald Spengler had to say about Marxism, where he called Marxism the capitalism of socialism. And I actually, it actually really hit home, because I think he's absolutely correct, talking about like the productivism and scientism of that can be a part of Marxism, specifically the Marxism, Second International German Marxism that he was dealing with on a regular basis is absolutely correct. And we find that same sort of criticism in Masaryk. And Masaryk's criticism is a comradely criticism, because he is also a socialist and he works with the Social Democrats, as part of his nation building project here. So I think it's really good for us to read people who we disagree with partially and find out what their good criticisms of the things that we think are.
Right.
Yeah. And I think like when I read Masaryk's essay called Marx and His Mistakes, that's probably where I disagree the most. Because I think his criticism is a little bit too pointed and a little too sharp, but it's very valuable to read. But I also think, just in general, I think I was trying to put 10 points that key aspects of Masaryk's philosophical and political thought. I was like, these are the 10. Then I actually put 11 instead. The last like this morning I said, oh, there's one more, and I put 11. But I want to talk about the things that I think. Well, at least that I share, that I agree with, that I think these are the good things, I think. And the first one is probably the hardest to like quickly encapsulate, but just the ethical socialism, which is he's a nonviolent reformist, and he has kind of semi-corporatist attitudes sometimes, but not all the time. But basically his conception of socialism is rooted in his Christian-humanism. Like he's like what we in the past would have called a utopian, which is to say an idealist or a not to be taken seriously.
Right.
Masaryk was a figure who deeply he took very seriously the message of Christ, and that he actually did believe. And in fact, his conception of revolution, his conception of socialism, and his conception of democracy were all the same, and they were all rooted in the absolute reformation of the human spirit. And that was like the part of the construction of the kingdom of God on earth, is that all human beings are potential. They all have potential, and they all have a use. And so when he talks about the violence in revolution, even though it's primarily because of the counter-revolution, but even violent revolutionaries are they're not exactly doing the work of Christ. And so his ethical socialism is probably the main thing. That is the reason why Czechoslovak communists just dismissed him. And
until they didn't
anymore.
Right.
Well, and until people like Dubček revived at least key aspects of what is a good way to say this? Masarykian socialism?
Yeah. Or so Czechoslovakism is the other thing that you could call it. Right. So for me, I reading Masaryk, I'm like, Masaryk is the last good liberal, right? He and it's because he's
very much is a liberal in that way.
Yeah, he is. He's very much a liberal. He's what I would call a liberal socialist, since I listened to that episode that you and Kevin did.
Yeah.
That was actually one of the things I was going to bring up is he just a liberal? Not just, but I mean, I'm not sure how I could make a distinction between him and liberal socialism. So, but
No, I would call him a liberal socialist, but I think that there is the one caveat is that he is very much so driven by like a romantic utopianism. And in most cases, you don't find liberal socialists that are. Like I would say that like he's got this view of progress that I would call Hegelian, that he wouldn't call Hegelian. He's got this view of progress that I think is very, very liberal. But in the same way, he makes criticisms of Marxism by saying things like, Marxism's insistence that capitalism had to happen before socialism, and that capitalism is actually good compared to the things before it, begged the question, why would we want communism? If and he like criticizes capitalism as being less humane and less good in many ways than the things that came before it, in a way that like romantics like William Morris would, right?
Yeah.
So the reason he's the last good liberal, or a kind of liberal socialist that I think I can agree with a little bit more than others, is because of that romantic sort of tempering of his sort of progressivism. Ben, you have your hand raised?
I do. Well, I think you're correct, but I also think he's also considered the father of what these all can be connected or co-determinist, but of what would become known as European social democracy, which is, these adaptations that began in the Second International. What I like about this reading from him is he really makes a strong case for why the revisionist line of thought is dealing with problems in early Marxist thought, dogmatisms and early Marxist thought that were kind of deaf and blind to where certain dogmatic readings of Marx lead. And I think, Jason, you, in the Measures Taken, took this up. Like Bernstein, Kautsky, and in a more attractive way, Masaryk here are taking, they're prefiguring later Marxist criticism of early Marxist dogmatism.
Yeah.
It's almost like the secular version of the process of Reformation, in which the early Reformation of the Catholic Church changes the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And how it sees itself. And so the Marxism that we live in and breathe today is reflected in the criticism Masaryk is making in his time. But he's doing it as not an anti-Marxist, but a socialist who is trying to draw out these contradictions that are not allowed to see the light of day in, orthodox Marxism.
Yeah, he's not an anti-Marxist, but he's very critical. I think I'm going to butcher this as a quote, but he said something like, "I have always supported working men. That has meant I have often supported socialism, and I have sometimes supported Marxism." Or like in his essay, Marx and His Mistakes, he ends after sometimes blistering criticism. He ends it by saying, "For the recognition and understanding of the true significance of the worker, of the proletarian question, Marx and Engels have done so much. Marx and Engels present all of the important questions of the time and of the life of the masses of workers, and have led the masses toward a theoretical and practical solution." And yet he also says things like, "If the brain is the final real cause of intellectual and social life, then I cannot see how communism could first develop in the course of history." Like basically Marx's materialism is from Masaryk. It's like it's not defensible. It's not supportable. It doesn't. He even said, if the Marxists are going to remain a force in politics in the world, they're going to have to eschew materialism, like altogether. And of course, I don't think that's true.
Well, yeah, but it makes me think of the Seymour article we discussed with Daniel.
Yeah.
Right. That was forefront in my mind reading Masaryk. In many ways, he's prefiguring that criticism.
Yeah, like I often think about like what might this have been if he was writing this in the 1940s or the 1970s versus in the pre and immediately post World War I era. And it was, I think it was in the group chat. Somebody said it was like a very Frankfurt School-ish.
That was Chris, yeah. Chris has talked about the ambiguities in Marxism and how that's why there are so many different strains. But it's beyond ambiguity. It becomes outright contradiction, which Masaryk draws out in a certain way. That is a difficulty between looking at Capitals Volume 1 and Volume 3, although I don't think that those are as wholly contradictory as he makes it out to be. But there are contradictions. There are strains of didacticism, especially from a lot of Engels' writing, which was originally misattributed to Marx, which he points out. But there's also dialectical thought. And so you have to be able to be critical enough to name which one is at work. And he's kind of doing that in a way that's a bit one-sided at times. But if I substitute Marxism for the kinds of, for Stalinism, for these really wooden formulations of Marxism, I'm totally on board with him, and I'm more take his side than any responses from that side. And you were saying, I'm sorry to Bogart the mic, but you were saying that his ethical nonviolent socialism, I think it's easy to see that, to have preconceived ideas about what that means. He's mostly emphasizing a wariness of aestheticizing violence and of attributing all importance on class struggle in its most egregious sense, to the detriment of the working and toiling classes, right? And this amoral materialism that he critiques later, which is evident in Marx as often as not.
Yeah, Masaryk he takes a very pragmatic approach to the question. Like, class struggle is real and it's a fact, but class war, like this celebration of titanic struggles, it's kind of missing the point. It's like, whatever it takes to get where we need to go, that's what we should do. So he's very in favor of revolution, like violent revolution, if that's what it takes to establish a democratic state, to break from the Austrian Empire and to establish a new state. But then, because it's a democratic state, he's like, well, then why would we still be violent revolutionaries? If it's a true democratic state, and if the functions of the state are to uplift the individual and also to reform them in terms of consciousness, uplift them in terms of their material well-being, and reform them in terms of their spiritual, in the ways that they can approach the world, then why would we need to be violent? It seems as though being violent, when you don't have to be, would have a stunting effect on the spiritual growth of the human being. If all men are brothers, then we should minimize brotherly conflict.
Right.
And I agree with them, but also, unfortunately, the capitalist state does not.
Right.
So
this is almost.
That's why I'm more like Lenin because of that.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm interrupting so much. This is also an instance of where his idealism. He's beginning almost from an abstract ethical position. He accuses Engels in his work on Feuerbach of reducing social ethics to class war. And basically, we might be more charitable, but I understand what he's saying. And also that Engels is saying equality will be the product of revolution, not of morality. And he's saying that's way too simplistic, because obviously the revolutionary impulse is in part driven by morality and ethics and love. But yeah, you don't get to start in a neat conditions of your own choosing.
I think that's
love is undermined at every instance.
Right.
That's one of the areas that I would say regretfully, he's wrong. Like, if we could actually accept that, in fact, all men are brothers, and that there's a message of the rise and fall of all of humans, then yes, of course, that I would tend toward his ethical, nonviolent, reformist socialism. But 100 years has passed since, almost 100 years since he died, and since that last 100 years has, I think, definitively shown that, like Lenin said, sometimes history needs a push.
Also, to be fair to him, I think the discourse and the possibilities of what democracy and social democracy mean are completely different today than they were in his time. You can link them and understand them retroactively, but there's just no, the global state of the left and of parliamentary bodies of power is just completely different.
Yeah, and that's funny, actually, because of that. That's where the second point that I put here seems like it would grow in importance, because Masaryk was not a figure of any one party. He was, in fact, in favor of what he calls the invisible party of all thinking people, which is a very liberal way of approaching the world.
Right. That's like what the founding fathers advocated.
Right. And of course, that is who we have to rely on right now. But I also think a party is just a necessity.
What else is on your list?
I've got like several things. The third thing is we've kind of talked about it already, but like the nation as a collective being, which is to be reformed, and also to the affairs of the nation to be conducted very much in the same way that the individual might be. So like, even though his thought is heavily in favor of focusing on individuals, he also has this conception of the totality of the universal as well as the particular. So like, we shouldn't get lost so much in the individual concerns, individual reform, individual uplift and success, that we lose sight of the totality of the fact that the nation is a collective being. And in the same way, he was a big advocate of the growth of the nation as a part of the eventual United States of Europe, and the universalization of this whole thing. It's like he was a nationalist, but he was not at all of a nationalist of the type that the average nationalist at the time was. Like he had this somewhat contradictory way of trying to basically be in favor of both and all at the same time.
He was super racist against the Russians, though.
Well, he was
He was like, that was like part of his criticisms of the Bolsheviks, is that they're just like a barbaric people who murder people, mass murder people without concern, and it's just a character of the Slavic blood type who don't have a European enlightenment like us, who actually care about human beings.
Which is a very typical liberal way to characterize Russians today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a little bit too caught up in these westernizing kind of myth, really.
Yeah.
It's just like this he was like a big proponent of the Enlightenment. So much so that he would look backwards in Czech history to like the Hussites and the Taborites as being like proto-Enlightenment figures. But they're really just not. If anything, they're kind of romantic figures. Very parochial, right. Very local. So because he felt like so much debt to the Enlightenment as like a process, an era in history which swept away a lot of old prejudices, he kind of had this one-sided way of viewing the world. And I think that's actually one of the ways in which he would have done very well to be more consciously Hegelian.
Mm. And in that way, he's very much so like Second International Marxists of all stripes, but specifically the Germans. And you think about the German Socialist Party going into World War I, the reason why they vote for war credits is because of those specific reasons, right? They don't want the Asiatic barbarians from the East to wash over Europe. So they're thinking, well, we're good culturally enlightened Germans, and our constitutional monarchy is at least a lesser evil compared to this Asiatic Russian barbarism. It's also sort of the way Plekhanov thought of Russia too, without using such like ethnically charged language. But he thought that Russia needed to undergo capitalism as an enlightening phase before it had socialism. So his arguments about why Russia was not ready for socialism are similar to Masaryk's.
And similar to Kautsky's as well.
And Kautsky as well, yeah.
And all of the West, which
Second International Marxists.
Been ready for socialism for a very long time, and yet has not actually started yet.
Yeah.
Unlike the barbaric Asiatic East, who was not ready for it and just started anyways.
Right. I mean, he makes some decent points about the sort of, I guess he didn't probably use the word totalitarian, but the sort of autocratic nature of Tsarism and like the top-down state and the surveillance state of Tsarism being potentially transferred over to a Bolshevik government because they hadn't gone through that democratizing, enlightening phase. And I got to say, that is what happens. And I don't think it has anything to do with the barbaric nature of the Russians so much so as just the dire circumstances that the Russians were in and sort of reversion to a stabilizing mechanism that they're familiar with.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like it's probably important just in case, if you're listening and you're like, this is my one stop for the knowledge of this entire subject, which is fine. But if that's the case, you shouldn't read too much into this. Like these like throwaway comments rather than like Masaryk's not a hostile to the Slavic soul. Like he doesn't write off the whole people all the time.
The Eastern Slavic soul, right?
Right. Although there are ways in which he betrays a prejudice of the East, but it's less conscious. I mean, sometimes it's conscious, but it's not written all throughout. That's kind of important. I feel like
he's a man of his time.
Right.
The way that who's the scholar who introduces his essay, Irazim Kohak, the way that he frames something that Masaryk is prescient on and prophetic, I think, that Chris was alluding to, is he says, to the extent to which democracy failed to function, socialism became a revolutionary movement. We're all familiar with that. And just those radical factors which make a revolutionary movement successful prevent it from consolidating its victory. The problem of democracy, and especially of social democracy, is the problem of transforming a revolutionary movement, which alone can initiate social change, into a reform movement, which alone can consummate it. That's something Masaryk is thinking about.
Yeah.
In that moment, but I think it plagues every revolutionary movement that is able to seize power, is how to transition into something that is that can last.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny because the experience of Czechoslovak socialism is perfectly emblematic of exactly that issue, that problem, or what Masaryk calls the problem of revolution, where like it's successful, and then now what? So then they try the Prague Spring. It's like, well, we're not going to allow that soft, slow reforming, changing nature. So what ends up happening is it falls apart. And what's really sad is it falls apart in Masarykian terms, but like divorced from any of the politics, the philosophy, or the ethics of Masaryk himself. So even like Václav Havel and the slogan of like "Pravda vitezi," the truth will win. The truth will prevail. Is actually, I didn't realize this until just recently. It's actually from Masaryk.
Really?
That's actually but because he was of the invisible party of all thinking people, that means that everybody can lay claim to him. And so
right.
Nobody's going to uphold and defend the legacy. So everybody can do it instead. So he undid his own legacy in that way.
Yeah. That's one of the things we talked about in the episode that we did on Czechoslovakism, Tomáš Masaryk and Czechoslovakism or whatever, is that he gets appropriated by opponents of socialism as being like a champion of bourgeois power and capitalism, and he was neither of those things.
Yeah, like not at all.
But I mean, he the state that he presided over was imperfect, and he was unable to hold it to the standards that he's set for his movement. Right, like Czechoslovakia remained a capitalist democracy that had, oligarchs and bourgeois millionaires that were exploiting the working class and whatever else. And his state didn't fulfill its promises to the people and to the Slovaks specifically, who were supposed to receive more autonomy and who were supposed to be integrated more fully into the system rather than ruled by the castle in Prague. And so, I mean, things didn't work out the way that he wanted them to. So his, even though he guarded against the excesses of revolution with his ethics, his stringent adherence to ethics, going so far as to not accept money during the revolutionary phase of, the birth of the Czechoslovak nation from anyone he considered to be ethically unsound, he still ended up at the head of a society that he considered to be unethical.
Yeah, it's actually that is the problem with this. Let's say that you can be a perfect individual. It doesn't really matter if nobody else can be. Like if you are the adherent and proponent of the invisible party of all thinking people. Well, what about all let's just call them unthinking people? What are you going to do about those people? And
Right.
I guess what Masaryk would say was like, well, the truth will prevail at some point. But if that's true, it will be the work of a revolutionary vanguard, I think.
It's not a self-propelled... Well, but I think... So one of the things that he's very critical of is that everything can fall into neat historical laws, and that history is moving all things that there's an objective dialectical force. I think what he describes often involves a dialectic. There is an interrelation between phenomena, but there isn't something totalizing about it. And maybe that's the case where he's not Hegelian.
Right. Am I mixing up the characters, or was he the one who was saying that dialectics is Manichaean?
I didn't read that in these two, but I do think there's a criticism
it was definitely in there.
Of the way they're used.
But I wasn't sure if it was Masaryk or the other M name that was like related to him. That was a Czech intellectual figure, but not like a political leader.
To be honest, I don't think I know. I think it was
something like that.
Yeah, I think it might have been Masaryk. I kind of don't remember though.
Yeah, one of them criticized dialectics as being Manichaean, and that spurred me to go down a rabbit hole of reading about Manichaeanism as a historical thing. And I was just like, wow, this is so interesting. I never read up on this before.
Yeah. For anyone who doesn't know, the phrase Manichaean just means like stark division between two opposing forces.
Yeah.
Because the Manichaeans believed in a good God and an evil God that were equally powerful, and that all throughout history, where everything that happens is a result of the gods battling, the evil God and the good God battling one another.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
That was, it used to, at one point in history, it was the dominant, non-polytheist religion in the world.
Right.
at one point, at one moment, and it was snuffed out by the Christian Roman Empire.
It was sort of not just them, also the Persians and the Chinese as well, because it stretched from Rome all the way into China. But it was sort of a synchronization of Christianity,
and Buddhism.
Well, not just Buddhism, but probably more important would be the Zoroastrian influence.
Yeah. They regarded like Buddha and Jesus both as prophets of God.
Yeah.
And, it was blended. It was taking this really interesting blend that you don't see in any of the dominant sort of, I don't know, the way the world is divided today. It's like I don't know. It's just such an interesting like moment in history that it was totally had nothing to do with anything, but it just that one word in the readings sent me down a rabbit hole reading about it.
We can bring it back to Tomáš Masaryk by talking about how St. Augustine was raised a Manichaean before he converted to Catholicism. Or Catholicism, right? Sorry, Eastern Orthodox. Before he was converted to Christianity, and and then of course Tomáš Masaryk was raised Catholic, and he grew up on St. Augustine. All right, we've brought it back around.
Well, I was going to bring it back around, Chris, by the way you define Manichaeanism. I think that is an apropos accusation of the way a lot of often Engels frames arguments.
Sure,
there is a reductive quality to these are often polemical writings, so we can read them with some grace. But I do think that Masaryk, from these readings you shared with us, Jason, his main criticism is that Marxists are guilty of being reductionist to a degree that kind of veils reality. And the materialism he's saying is a millstone around our neck historically has been this sort of epistemological materialism, this ontology that is a different reality, but is still not reality.
Yeah, right. And actually, this is part of, I think, when I said that, I think that Masaryk is maybe more Hegelian than he thinks he is. This is kind of what I mean. His opposition to dialectical thinking is his opposition to this very crude bifurcation of the good thing and the bad thing, and they're competing.
Right.
And the end result is a new synthesis. This very clunky whatever. This this beginner's dialectical formula that most Marxists, most people just don't ever move beyond. Because Masaryk is instead because he's such a proponent of the humanist, the ethic, the message of Christ. He sees it as everybody being able to work toward a common goal, and that there's this unfolding of this greater and greater, more ethically sound, more unified perspective. And that's actually more what Hegel's actually talking about with dialectical movement, is that that there is a truth, there is an absolute truth, and that everything is just the various approaches to this singular truth that's working itself out in contradiction, but they're not like from a different source. Like, it's not like the workers are over here and the capitalists over there, and they like march up and then they have to fight. They're both internal to this same the same phenomenon, which is itself the product of previous phenomenon, which is also just like all of human social development is all the same thing.
So I was going to say that, like, whenever Masaryk, I don't remember which article it was, whenever he's talking about how Masaryk, his theory of history, rejected historical materialism because he rejected the dialectical movement of history because he thought it was too reductive and simplistic, and he thought that, like, the thesis antithesis synthesis model was simplistic and dumb. Revolutions, it is, yes. Revolutions, it wasn't, history isn't driven by revolutions, and he thought more of like the method for change being like the Protestant Reformation, and that like the history is driven by the synthesis of ideas, building on each other. And I'm like, dude, you're just describing the dialectical movement of history.
Yeah, exactly.
And like the way that he thinks of the Protestant Reformation as a model for transitioning to socialism, rather than like the revolutionary method. I'm like, dude, the Protestant Reformation was the beginning of the bourgeois revolution. When you think of the bourgeois,
super violent,
incredibly violent over hundreds of years.
Also, it happens to be that Karl Kautsky's, when he talks about what revolution is likely to look like in the Western, in the bourgeois societies, we have a model in the Reformation. Like that's
right.
For the Marxists, the Protestant Reformation is what we mean by revolution.
I really think that Masaryk is clouded, has his view of what Marxism is clouded by the Marxists that he interacted with.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, he also,
just like we did.
Exactly. He was there was a note in there that he had an issue with like the the Bolsheviks' use of justification of certain actions because the means justify the end, or the ends justify the means. And he disagreed that that kind of ends justifying the means thinking. But anytime that criticism comes up, and it's always a sort of a liberal or a just a humanist sort of criticism of overly violent actions of some sort. That's how it's always wielded. But anytime that phrase comes up, it's like a brain-stopping simplification that's not the right word that I'm trying to come up with, but that just totally misses the point. There is no one on earth who disagrees that that ends justify means. The question or the objection that people are making is one of two things. One, these ends don't justify these means,
right?
Or two, they're saying these means are not an effective way of accomplishing the stated ends. Like, so it's a strategic criticism, or it's a suggestion that you're not putting enough value on you're not weighting the different parts of the formulation correctly. But everyone, including the people who make that criticism, agree that ends justify the means, in that they think that not taking some sort of significant actions right now today because we don't want to kill this group of people over here or whatever is worth the lives that we will feed into the grist mill of industrial capitalism, grinding on. Right. They are willing to watch that happen in order to not take this other action over here that they regard as too violent or whatever it is. Maybe they're right. Maybe that is the correct calculus to make. You don't even have to take a position on that one way or the other to recognize that you are engaging in ends justifying the means calculation there. It's just
right.
There's no way around that reality of the world. Like you can't step out of bed without engaging in ends justify the means thinking.
So I'm going to read Masaryk's criticism of that sort of thinking in the most charitable way possible, and say that he did not eschew violence. Right? He helped raise the Czechoslovak legions to fight against Austria-Hungary. He thought that violence was necessary. I think that he just thought that violence needed ethical guidelines that were greater than ends justify means. So. Yeah. Right. Like everyone always engages in that sort of moral calculus, but with a lot of Marxists, and this is a criticism that we've made a number of times on this podcast, is that there isn't one other than the goal is revolution, and anything done in that service is good. And I think that the way you find that manifesting in your daily life, organizing with other leftists, is that, like, I think that MLs can be some of the least ethical people I've ever met. They'll slander, they'll lie in order to, like, edge out people that they think are politically bad.
Yeah,
like
edge out people out
lives.
of like out of
their
their
5-person study group.
Yeah, exactly, for nothing, for just absolutely nothing. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
I think that there's like this justification that comes with their LARPing of 1917.
Yeah.
That, like, you know, since they can't be Iron Felix and, you know, shoot us in the alleyway with the other Czechists, what they'll do instead is engage in an internet slander campaign with something that they know that definitely never happened in order to ruin your life.
What's ironic there is
Yeah.
that in their supposed emulation of Lenin and company, they're forgetting the previous 20 to 30 years in which those very same people were doing everything they could to, like, keep as the band together as much as possible. And there were moments of schism, but, like, it's not like Lenin was trying to divide their numbers at every instance.
Well, that's the thing about American leftists, and it's probably the same everywhere else too. I don't want to, like, sound like a reverse American exceptionalist here, but, like, American leftists are LARPing the revolution generations before the revolution's happened, right? You know, LARPing a revolutionary situation in the lowest stakes environment possible.
I do think so. Masaryk's the criticism you bring up, Kevin, that is triggering for all of us. The ends justifying the means thing. I think we're so used to that, the context of that being the most obnoxious.
The bad faith weaponization by libs.
Right.
Yes.
It's on the one hand, you have the irritating MLs who think that the ends of I win justify literally any means. And that's a problem. And then on the other side of that, you have the liberal humanists who will wield that criticism of the ends justifying means as a way to, stick a thumb up their ass and watch children starve to death. Do anything.
Hey, let's qualify that criticism of MLs being, ethically unprincipled by saying we know a few MLs who have done this sort of stuff, and not any other kinds of socialists.
Yeah, you weren't speaking abstractly. You were articulating like a specific situation that happened.
A set of specific instances. I can think about 4 or 5 of them. Yeah.
In particular, have in mind Frizzo fight back in particular.
I can also think of IS Trotskyists and anarchists and radlibs who are just as mercenary.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think in those instances they literally think that, like, they're doing the right thing, whereas I think that these MLs that I'm specifically thinking of have admitted that they were lying to other people in order to ruin the group or whatever to get their way.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I was going to say, Kevin, is that putting aside that obnoxious experience, Masaryk here, I think, is trying to remind socialism, socialists writ large, and Marxists that we mustn't forget that we share a collective project that ends and begins with ethics.
Right.
And there's even if there is some unethical part of that, it is still in service of those ethics. So I think I think it actually complicates ethics, but you can't just do the thing where we're going to forget about that, which is what our ML friends do.
Right. And this is his Kantianism, is that humans may never be used as a means toward an end.
Right.
Yeah. Human life has infinite value if you ever enter it into a means and ends calculation. A human life outweighs all other considerations.
Kevin, what you were saying is making me think of it's been coming up when I've been watching different interviews with anti-Zionist Jewish thinkers, and one of the things that's brought up frequently is that core tenet in Judaism is that every individual is a universe. And there's this passage in
unless they're Palestinian.
If Palestinians don't count, then your Judaism doesn't either, is the point they're making. There's a passage here in the Masaryk's Philosophy of History. It's page 14, which I would like to read if you don't mind. I feel like he's understanding something about what makes revolution possible. He's understanding something about history, which we often miss as quote unquote revolutionaries. He says, work, real work, is small jobs, everyday work, just as every science is built upon everyday phenomena. So the real worker is he who knows how to do detailed, everyday, essential work, and who does it willingly. The so-called great deeds, heroic actions, heroic revolutions, are greater in idea than in fact. Utopia comes by patient labor. The heroes of the future will declare themselves by care for that which interests no one, by doing what is tedious and humdrum. Hitherto there have been few such. People would rather sacrifice their lives than work. Great epochs are not made in a moment. History, no more than nature, proceeds by leaps. Revolutionary changes, though they appear to happen suddenly, have been long prepared in obscurity. And there's more, but I'll finish. On the one side is lack of method and order, the occasional appearance of what is called genius, bohemian disorderliness, excitement, nervous agitation. On the other, certainty of aim, clear thinking, beauty and purity of life and deed, and actual activity. Not fantasy, but poetry. Not muscularity, but strength. And this has so many resonances with many of the thinkers he's critiquing throughout these essays. You know, it's there's Lenin in here. There's certainly Marx. There's Hegel. I just think he's coming at it from a different angle and filling it in, you know?
Yeah, very much so. I think there's a lot of that going on.
What I was thinking when I was reading all this stuff that I disagreed with is that it was all incredibly admirable and like beautiful sentimentality, you know? And I thought, good, like we would need more people like him to be opposition within our, you know, socialist society.
Absolutely.
Right? He's like the socialist conscience. Yeah. That he should be sitting on one of our shoulders next to Lenin on the other. You know?
Yeah, if your party is nothing but soulless, you know, cynical, true believers, but nonetheless, you know, willing to blend every, you know, orphan in a blender to advance whatever, you know, the battle line 5 feet or whatever it is, then like you know, that's how you end up with the Bolshevik Party of the under Stalin. It was not running a personalist dictatorship. It was even by CIA, you know, internal documents that have since been declassified. They wrote about how the Bolshevik Party was not a personalist dictatorship. It was a collective leadership, but it was a collective leadership that was more than happy to engage in inhumane actions in the interest of whatever policy goal they decided to lay down at a given moment in a given time, and willing to just, you know, throw away human lives like they're nothing. And that's not how it didn't work. You know, here's my criticism of that is the strategic criticism of it didn't work, guys. It didn't work.
It didn't work. And it set the project back.
Exactly.
Big time.
For, I don't know, maybe all time, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know. Hopefully not.
It might have set it back for all time. It definitely at least set it back for a few decades.
Yeah, how I am not a Kantian is I would say, you know, if you were truly presented with that trolley problem or whatever, and flip the switch and kill 5 people and save humanity or whatever, you know, whatever it is, then like, yeah, of course, sacrificing a few people is worth it. the problem, the other side of that, the problem with this, that as it played out under the Stalin's Bolshevik Party, was that is it didn't work, and like the consequences, the outfall wasn't so A or B. It wasn't like you're just going, which track are you picking? Flip the switch and you're going to go down track B, which ends in socialism. That didn't happen, and instead we have a legacy of mass murder and horror,
brutality.
and brutality that cannot be justified given the lack of success in creating a better world as a result of it. So it's just, it didn't.
We're all defenders of the Soviet Union here too. If you're tuning in for the first time, but we're heavily critical of it at the same time.
Well, right, and so like Masaryk, his criticisms of that kind of thinking is not just that, like, upon reflection it appears to have been correct, because that's just not good enough. It turns out that he was kind of onto something. He was prescient in ways which I think we maybe didn't need to have to go through it in order to know he was right.
Right.
Because all of history happened before that time as well.
Right. Well, what his philosophy of history is pointedly critical of the Marxists. He says that who wrote this one? Who wrote the Masaryk's philosophy of history? R.R. Betts writes that Marxists erred by placing history over and above the present and the future. So history becomes this thing that is not tethered to the reality of the present and the future. It's this other thing that is an abstraction.
Big other.
Yeah.
A big
right.
other,
It basically the idea of history. It takes the place of God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it works in the same way. So the official atheism of Bolshevism utilized the concept of God, and in a very, in a way which, like you said, it's abstracted from what history actually is, which is the past and the future in that very minute moment of the present, like right now, and that right now and right now and right now and so on, right? Like the present is always receding. But that's what history is. History is just the movement into the future from the past through the present. Whatever.
Yeah.
What was that Stalin quote? Only history can judge me.
Yeah. Oh. So
I mean, basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there's something that I thought was interesting, that one of the authors translates left-wing communism and infantile disorder as the childish disease of leftism in communism.
Whoa.
Oh, I like that better.
I looked it up, and that is a more accurate translation. I looked at the Russian, and the words in Russian that I did know were not present in the English translation that we're familiar with. So I looked up that particular translation and looked up why it was translated like that, and it looked. And I don't know why they changed it. Maybe because it's catchier that way. But that is the more accurate translation, is the childish disease or disorder, childish disorder or disease, whatever, of leftism in communism.
I mean, that happens a lot with English translations of Slavic languages. All of the complexity in the poetry, and also German. Really, there's a philosophical bent to all of this, where like something like okay, well, to try to bring it back to this of this subject, Masaryk's World Revolution is translated in English as the making of a state, because he is writing about a country for the Czechoslovak people, so that's the making of a state. But that is what he's doing, but also by defining it in that way and by translating it in that way, the English publisher is stripping the world revolution as a concept that the making of the state is pregnant with.
Right.
That a world revolution is very much the sum total, the end perspective of all of this. Like the making of a state is only a piece of the world revolution. And so if you translate it as the making of a state, what you're doing is you're saying, I only want to count to one. I don't want to go any further. And that basically means that you're introducing Masaryk's thought in a very limited way. It's very counter to his own purpose, actually. And speaking of his purposes,
Hey,
I kind of want to go through this whole list.
Well, okay, but
what number are we on?
We've only done 3 out of 11.
Chris, I just wanted to say real quick, Chris, what you said about the translation reminds me. One of my mom's ex-boyfriends was pretty much a Stalinist, but he's the one that turned me onto like socialism and communism. And one of the first things he told me was that communism it's neither left nor right. It's as we understand it, it's a wholly different approach to politics.
I mean, that's correct.
Which your anecdote reminded me of that.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that's absolutely true, especially in the parameters that define what leftism is and isn't in the West now, and probably back then too. Well,
it's like the left of what, the right of what?
Yeah.
It's
just overly simplistic term that has lessons in descriptive value. The further into post-modernity we delve.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So even though we've only done 3 out of 11, I think we actually will find that we've kind of talked about a lot of these things anyways, but I do want to kind of just go through the list. That way the listener knows, like, well, you said 11, you've only done 3,
Yeah.
So number 4 is a religious faith as a necessity, but not anchored in myths from the past, but rather rooted in science and philosophy and social existence.
Right.
Which is to say, the movement of spirit, that faith in God is not meant to be looking backward and holding back human progress, but rather it's meant to be synonymous with human progress. And I will also say number 6, which is a belief in progress, but progress marked by the improvement of humanity and not by strictly technical terms. So like progress doesn't just mean that now you have an iPhone and before you had to like go to the phone, which is mounted on the wall. That's not progress. Progress for Masaryk is like, are people more able to read? Are they more likely to discuss phenomena? Are they more likely to have an opinion about something that's happening external to their own experience? Like the fact that these villagers know what's happening at the border, even though they live hundreds of kilometers away, that's a sign of progress. And so, again, I think I agree with both religious faith as Masaryk understands the term, and I also agree with his notion of progress as he understands the term. But I do not agree with religious faith in the way that was presented to me in the past, which I rejected, which is why I was an atheist for a long time, or in progress in the way that I was, in the way that most people mean progress.
Right. Like in the Steven Pinker version of the word progress, which is completely illusory. First of all, like not correct, and also just has more to do with like you have iPhone and TV, so progress kind of stuff,
right? Like the fact that you can order Postmates is not progress.
No, that's the ultimate sign of how degenerate our society is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the fact that you could order Postmates was peripheral to the fact that human beings were able to converse in multiple languages about deeply the deep philosophical concepts, that would be progress. But the Postmates would be incidental to the progress rather than indicative of the progress.
The United States is about 21% functionally illiterate right now. And that is way down from its peak, which I don't remember exactly when its peak was, but it's way less than Cuba, for one. But anyway, as a society, we have like absolutely ceased to progress. And You can see that manifesting in any number of ways. Like ask any liberal right now if you think our society is progressing. But yeah, so our society is absolutely not progressing, even though Steven Pinker and other people like him would have us believe it. In the long arc of history, fewer people die from preventable diseases than did like 200 years ago, and fewer people per capita die in ethnic cleansing than a few hundred years ago or whatever.
AKA the ends justify the means.
Yeah. So yeah, it's all. Yeah, I would say that I do not agree or believe in that notion of progress either. That the mainstream liberal notion of progress.
Yeah, and incidentally, that's what undergirds number 5. Just because I skipped over it, which is an opposition to blind objectivism and positivism. Mm-hmm. This notion that there is an objective reality, and that just that there's the non-metaphysical rationalist version of science. Which again is just, these are all just things which we have already spent a lot of time opposing and disagreeing with and deconstructing. It's just really nice to see it presented in this way.
The teleological sort of Whiggish view of history that I think a lot of Marxists are guilty of, even though they think they're doing historical materialism, what they're actually doing is liberal Whiggishness,
Exactly.
Yeah. The inevitable march of progress and the inevitability of communism and, whatever. Every single failure is just a stepping stone on the way to ultimate victory kind of thing.
Masaryk calls this historicism, and he confronts it with what he calls realism. We should come back to that when you finish your list.
Well, I don't know. Just do it now because you just brought it up. Like,
well, I'm looking at
define realism.
Well, he defines it by the study of things as they are, not as they were, or how they came to be what they are. So I can read that as a kind of presentism, but I think it's more than that because he's obviously concerned with history. But he's mostly just, he has a problem with Marx and Engels. He says it was their insistence that the past reveals the working of a process of historical dialectic that he has a problem with. He said, over against excessive historicism, I place realism. First things, afterwards development. So we might have some disagreements with him here. And if I have to decide which is the more important, I shall say things, the static.
I would say he is guilty of presentism. He says that the present should be used to understand history and not the other way around. And I'm like, it should be both, man.
Yeah, it has to be both.
Yeah.
I think that Masaryk is a victim of excessive pragmatism. It's like, whatever works, that's what we'll do. That's what's valuable. Is just whatever makes sense right now. That whatever means. But again, it's like, but to what end? But that's I think why you could have a figure like Václav Havel being able to appropriate Masaryk's language and even his image in some ways because it's too vague.
But there is a key ingredient where he's a Clarion, and that's he says, from history, I cannot discover what I ought to do. And what I ought to do is what really matters. And I think there's deep resonance with Marx there, even though there's also some contradiction with Marx. But
and a lot of contradiction with Marxists.
Yeah. But he has an insight when it comes to relating the understanding of history with the will to act. Yeah.
Well, oh, sorry. Go.
No, you go. I was going to look at that quote that I sent you.
I was going to say he does the philosophers have always interpreted the world. The point is to change it. He essentially says the same thing with talking about history and historians, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he said, here's what I sent you guys earlier. History, if it is exact, enables us in some, but always in a limited measure, to foresee, but it does not enable me to determine what in a given case I ought to do or not to do. Foresight is not action. Action springs from the will, not only from knowledge. So, yeah, I think that's just a glaring reminder to us who get kind of lost in diagnosing.
I sort of thought about Masaryk as the anti-Hitler, where like his philosophical understanding of the world is built on the same type of reasoning, right? Like he puts a lot of emphasis on voluntarism and will, and he is also a nationalist and a socialist, and
right.
he has the same sort of like disdain for the scientism and the class-based view of the world that Hitler had. He has a lot of the same types of problems with Marxism and liberalism and modernity that Hitler did, but Masaryk is the ultimate champion of modernity. Yeah. While Hitler was, weaponizing a hatred of modernity against liberalism and communism, etc. I thought that like their sort of utopianism, emphasis on will, the disregard for the scientism of Marxism, and for the sort of like the structure of the philosophical systems. It's all very similar, but obviously not that similar.
Oh wow! I just realized he was in office until 1935.
Yeah,
yeah. He died in 1937.
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah, he died like right before the Nazis took over when they invaded the Sudetenland. Interestingly enough, that's actually number 7 on my list. Is a conviction that material forces can be equaled by the strength of ideals.
Yeah, there we go.
Like for Masaryk, it's more important, and it's actually a big part of his qualms with the dogmatism of social democracy. He's like, well, material forces are not more important than the relative spiritual health, mental, physical, emotional health of a population. That ideals are just as important, if not more important, than material forces. And the Viet Cong might also agree.
Well, Mao thought the same thing. We always sort of like I always sort of make fun of Mao for sounding
yes,
like
you
Hitler.
Do.
But no, I mean like this. It's the same sort of thing. And to a certain extent, there is a motivating sort of kernel of truth in all of this, right?
Well, right. And I think what matters here is that Masaryk is speaking from a position of like deep familiarity with industrial society. He lives in Prague. He travels in London and in New York. And he talks about how there's this obsession and this overcorrection of this enlightenment too much. Whereas someone like Mao, or somebody else even in an even more agrarian society might say, yeah, we just don't need that at all. It's like, well, but Masaryk is saying, well, yeah, like Pol Pot. It's a really good example. Yeah. Masaryk is saying, because we have the technical means, we need to focus on the ideal, the convictions of the ideals, lest we err on the side of over reliance on the technical means, or lest we advocate, like, let's say like a Falk, like a fully automated luxury communism. It's like,
right.
More important is the ideals. Like I've said this at least a few times. The point of all this is freedom. It's the liberation of the human spirit. And luxury it's a nice aside if we have it. And if not, it's okay, as long as we have freedom.
What's the next on the list? We need to get moving. We're at an hour and a half now.
Well, number 8 is a persistent dissatisfaction with one's own knowledge. That's all. Just like, if you read this Talks with Masaryk, when he's just like pontificating about his experiences in life, he's always trying to find a new way to approach a question, even though it might have already been settled. Like, it's, oh, that's from the past. And yet, it's never really fully settled. He seemed to have been, for his entire life, obsessed with forever circumlocuting and the truth and figuring out another way to approach a question, to know more, to fully flesh out every single bit of every kind of knowledge that a person might have. And it's admirable for sure. And you can see how
very Hegelian.
It's very it's very Hegelian. The number 9 we kind of already talked about. It's just sociology, philosophy, psychology, etc. These are all tools for the ultimate goal of reforming mankind, to uplift and reform all individuals, and thus the collective, and thus the nation, and thus the world.
I would say that, like, he has this view of change that I always make fun of, and that is that the aggregation of the change of individuals will amount to the critical mass needed to change the world.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, he kind of does, but he also, like, again, like, he was an advocate for, we have to win Czechoslovak independence and make it a democracy so that we can focus on the individual, so that the individual can then make the nation, so that the nation can help make the world better.
Right. It's a very Enlightenment view of the way that, change happens, I think, is that you create a better society so you can create better individuals, and better individuals will help propel the greater society forward. So, yeah, I mean, I guess he's being very Hegelian in his championing of individualism.
Well, it's an idealistic framework. He believes history is the history of thought. And he says masses, classes, and states and nations cannot think. Only the individual has a mind. So, I don't know. I mean, I think that maybe is a way of modifying our collectivism, how we think of its makeup. But I do think there's a fundamental difference.
Yeah, I think I agree. And actually, point number 11, I'll come back to point number 10. Point number 11 is that Masaryk overrates the Enlightenment, which we've already talked about at length. I just think it's enough to add a point to my list. Is all of this amounts to an overcorrection on the side of, again, even what he thinks he is opposing, the positivism, the objectivism, the scientism. He comes from a position which he maybe is not conscious of where he stands exactly. And I think, he overrates the Enlightenment.
Well, he's not a systematic thinker.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he kind of mocks systematic philosophy and philosophical systems, I mean. But he would be helped by having one.
Yeah.
The last point is just, I said, too critical of Marx and Engels. Too critical, but mostly also correct.
I would say in a large portion he's correct. I didn't really weigh out enough of what he said. I haven't read enough of what he said to determine whether or not he's mostly correct or not. But I would say that there are some criticisms of Marxism and of Marx and Engels that are absolutely spot on. And I think that where he's wrong in criticizing Marx and Engels specifically, he is more right in criticizing Marxists.
Yeah, I think that's right. I want to read this
contemporary Marxism of his time specifically.
Yeah. No, I think it's true of contemporary Marxists of every time, including not just our own time, but even the times which we look backwards toward and celebrate. We say that's
the good times. Yeah.
Yeah, even the good times. I think we're a little bit overwrought a lot of time.
Yeah.
Which suggests that the whole fucking theory needs to be supplemented at the very least with something to make it not so that.
It might need a little bit of revision every once in a while.
Uh-oh.
Oh, no.
Or maybe the revision will never be done. In the Hegelian sense, maybe.
Yeah, maybe absolute knowing is a permanent agenda.
Let it be known the official regrettable century position is Bernstein was right.
So
I'm more of a revisionist in the Maoist sense. Whereas I disagree with Maoism, so that makes me a revisionist.
So that actually would be a really good note to end on, but I kind of want to read this passage of a book.
Go for it.
Yeah, go for it.
It's from Talks with Tomáš Masaryk by Karel Čapek. I think it's Čapek. Hang on, is this right?
That's the Czech author of War with the Newts?
Yes. And yes,
Okay.
that's Čapek. Yeah,
Okay.
the upside down arrow over the C makes it a cha.
It's always right. The hot chick. Okay, so this is from Talks with Tomáš Masaryk by Karel Čapek. He says, as I see it, everything he says belongs to one of two basic categories. The first consists of the certainties, firm principles, and truths that he has settled upon. These he expresses forcefully, and with uncommon terseness and brachiological concision, emphasizing his point with a clenched fist or an energetically raised finger. The second consists of meditations, probings, the endless road to knowledge, the endless criticism and self-criticism, and I can't tell which is more characteristic, the clear-cut, steadfast certainty of a man of firm knowledge and beliefs, or the never-ending pursuit of truth. And I would say that's why Masaryk is such a fascinating figure, and why he's somebody worth contending with as more than just the first president of a country which no longer exists.
Рабочие крестьяне не смогут прожить без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.